what I think is so interesting about the discussion around the oral traditions is that it's often, when people reference it, it's very often implied that the oral traditions was, it's a primitive form. You know, it's like, oh, they were doing the oral traditions because it was their primitive way of continuing the tradition, which downplays the fundamental importance of vibration, right? It downplays the Matrika Shakti, which is what I want to talk about now, because I remember for me, I used to be a singer, and music has always been fundamental to my life, but music was always purely an expression. You know, it's like reserved for this kind of category of expression, but it wasn't kind of illuminating anything primary or fundamental at least in my own life, besides my own kind of emotional whatever. But it's, you know, when I learned of the kind of philosophy around Matrika Shakti, it was, and this idea of vibration and Vak that the tradition talks about, it's what permitted me the experience, because I was actually, you know, once I was intellectually open, then I could be open, at least experientially in my own practice, to, you know, chanting the Rudram and having this kind of, you know, enjoyment in just the practice of chanting it. So I wanted to kind of explore like what the reason why I wanted to talk about Matrika Shakti was because I was listening to the Buddha at the Gas Pump panel discussion you did with Sally Kempton, who I've also interviewed for this podcast. She's really lovely, and the whole discussion around quantum physics, which you've brought up already, and the Matrika Shakti. So I don't know where the question is in there, but if you could maybe describe what the role of the Matrika is, and talk a little bit more about this, vibratory potency that is part of the experience of this kind of tradition.
Well, yes, I remember this panel very well. And it was a great joy and a great honor to share it with Sally Kempton, and not just because there was an opportunity to share the passion and to speak on the topic of Kashmir Shaivism, and Menes Kafatas was with us, and organized by Rikarcha, but also because of Sally Kempton's intimate connection to a great teacher of our time, Baba Muktananda, Swami Muktananda, that played tremendously important role in my own sadhana on a subtle plane. And of course, my own introduction to the Kashmir Shaiva teachings were through the discourses of Swami Muktananda.
Oh, okay.
The early discourses of Swami Muktananda were all kind of loosely based, rather steeped in Advaita Vedanta. He himself gravitated gradually towards a more Shaiva perspective as he was discovering these teachings. This could sound paradoxical for some listeners. How can someone who claims to be enlightened master already teaching others? Actually, teaching is not even the right term here.
Yeah.
In whose presence many people simply break open, awaken, still finds joy in exploring and finding and looking for the possibilities of understanding perhaps this from the scriptural, traditional perspective. And especially I find this, forgive me for saying judgmental attitudes in the non-dual communities, where people are very quick to point out that for the one who is in a non-dual state, all interests fade away. And, the person essentially would show no interest to anything. And this is certainly not, well, you said it exactly. It does sound boring, like if the aim or the goal of self-realization was to become a log of wood, then drifting somewhere in the Pacific and then thrown on the beach in one of the islands in British Columbia, then yeah, well, great. Thankfully, there are many different perspectives on this. And what I'd like to also mention, which is very, very important, I don't know, it's perhaps enough to give it a whole entire interview or two, about how varied self-realization can be. When we speak of enlightenment, we tend to take for granted, or we tend to assume that everyone is in the presence of that same taste, as Ken Wilber put it, which of course not Ken Wilber's way of describing it. It belongs to Zen culture, that same flavor, same taste.
Yeah.
That same taste, by the way, is a misunderstanding of the highest degree of cognition, because that same taste actually belongs to the witnessing state of consciousness. But I don't want to deflect us from here, so feel free to put a bookmark. We can come back to that, why the same taste belongs to the witnessing state of consciousness rather than the true unity, or true non-duality. But this panel, though I was really, really enjoying, being in this panel, I don't think really succeeded in delivering what we set to share, because the topic is so vast.
Yeah.
And Kashmir Shaivism, though enjoys now tremendous popularity, still remains largely unknown area.
Yeah.
Unknown area, even within those who consider themselves versed in Tantras, because it has a unique perspective, even within the scope of Tantric philosophies or Tantric methodologies. It shares a lot, of course, with other Tantras. Now, there are voices both among the adepts and scholars that actually Kashmir Shaivism is very much a revival of the authentic early Upanishadic teachings. So in other words, there's a perspective that Kashmir Shaivism itself, as Ananda Coomaraswamy, I think that was, or Rabindranath Tagore, forgive me, I could be mixing them here. I think it's most probably Rabindranath Tagore who said, the last best kept secret of India. It was the last best kept secret of India back then when Rabindranath Tagore spoke of it. Mm-hmm. And it is pretty much remains the last best kept secret of India today. Mm. Only a couple of decades ago, the most comprehensive publishing house, State University of New York, only had a handful of people on the board who represented the Kashmir Shaivism studies. Yeah. These are legendary people. Lillian Silber, Andrei Padua, Mark Duchkovsky, great British scholar who essentially sacrificed his entire life to study this. Yeah. Moved for that to India, and my heart goes off to these scholars who essentially kept the torch alive in terms of giving their entire life to the Gnoli, I should mention, of course. You see, they're very different names. It's like Italians, French, Brits. Nobody knew about Kashmir Shaivism. Nobody knew back then. Even 20 years ago, there was very little. Swami Muktananda already was teaching hundreds and thousands of people under the umbrella of Kashmir Shaivism. And Sally Kempton was really, she must have had such an amazing karma to generate it. She was chosen by Swami Muktananda to travel with her when he was teaching. So she partook firsthand in what Muktananda was imparting. When we say that, it's very important to understand that it was an adept. And his expositions on Tantric Shaivism of Kashmir has an additional value because it was not a regurgitation of what he learned, but rather reevaluation of what he was living to give this teaching essentially, its value in our day and time. And that fact also gave me that same audacity, that same courage to step into that under the umbrella. Because to tell the truth, realization itself does not have name. It does not have, it does not have anything that one can put into the language for quite a while. There are phases of being utterly speechless about it. And I welcome everyone who cherishes these phases and harnesses these phases for as long as they could.
Yeah.
This, if only I could, whenever people ask, when is the right time to teach? And people do ask. I've awakened 2 years ago or 5 years ago, this intensity, this and that. I feel like I'm ready to go out, but something tells me, the one who is already took the bull by the horn, they're already teaching. You can't stop them. This is also the perils of our time. These people are already creating communities. They're creating the massive followers. But this is the age and time. We kind of touched that in the way how this probably is orchestrated by the karmic currents anyway, which we choose our teachers in the same way, but essentially is a reflection of our own glories and idiosyncrasies. But when someone wishes to go out, I always say that how much time was given to integration? Because it's very easy to develop language for it. You read 2-3 books, you have your favorite teacher, you hear them speaking, and then you've got there it is.
Yeah.
You will have the language for it. And you hear that, you see that. But the language has to rise, essentially, from that place of paravak. It has to rise where it is being pushed through your entire being, through your diaphragm into your chest, as it looming through your throat, and then only to be expressed through the vocal cords. And there you have that which begins to vibrate the air around. So when that comes from that depth, this is perhaps a sign to open one's mouth, having something to say. So this, not sure where exactly am I going to, because you confessed you don't know exactly where the question, so it's all, I hope, in sync, right? So we're just tentatively touching upon something here. This sound, this shimmering ocean of sound, every form in its essence is sound condensed as matter. Every form, everything that has any appearance, the most refined, subtle, fragile appearance to the density of granite or any planet that is denser than the granite slab. All this is nothing but sound, and this is scientific reality. No one argues with that. It's like arguing that the earth is still flat. It kind of belongs to these arguments. We understand today that there are different ways of how to view reality. The scientist views reality in this way, and it has poetry to it.
Yeah.
Like John Hagelin, with whom I was also on a panel at my first appearance at Science and Non-Duality back in 2012. He is known for his investigations into the supersymmetry theories. And as we know that these three are the most cutting edge, or so have been so far: the superfluidity, the supersymmetry, and the superstring. So this perspective that everything is sound, and how the sound collapses essentially into patterns, and how out of the myriad of patterns, these interference patterns being born. And within these interference patterns, something appears, what we call then matter, something which then gains a solid appearance. These interference patterns, it's who we are in the form. This is our solar system, and the whole known cosmos is the result of these interference patterns within otherwise with an otherwise incomprehensible vastness of pure silence. So the understanding, this is where Tantra is so exciting, because it is precisely that methodology which found on these very understandings, on these very experiences, on these very principles, all the major tantric doctrines come and have direct relationship to this vak, to this teaching that everything is sound. It's this, you've mentioned earlier, Pratyabhijna Hridayam, but the doctrine of vibration, the Spanda Karikas, which is another very important Kashmir Shaiva scripture, it's that views the universe precisely in these terms, as the vibratory field of pure awareness, at the heart of all perception. It is that. And obviously, that is not belong to individual being. It belongs to the awareness itself. It's indispensable property of awareness. And that's what the glory of this teaching is, that to stepping into that realization, to being able to take that stand as consciousness that this essentially is my own essential nature. My reality is this reality. Everything that I perceive down to the senses is nothing other than the throb of my own awareness, quiver at the heart of my own consciousness. So, of course, this is just trying to condense it to the format of this discussion, which is a lovely challenge in itself. But if you see what I'm trying to say, that it's the mode of perception, just like in the double slit experiment, or which led to these breakthroughs in quantum physics, to these realizations where one way or the other reality is indeterminable, because if we know the location, we don't know the the quality, what have you. If we know the quality, we don't know the location. In other words, wave versus particle. Yeah. So it is this at once being something particular made out of particles, and at the same time being waves. And this is, of course, maybe mind cannot comprehend it immediately. But it is what happens in the breakthroughs, in spiritual breakthroughs, in what we call realizations. It is this beautiful dance, it is this beautiful oscillation between this ebb and flow, between being something in particular, this embodied jiva, this embodied soul, and at the same time, infinitude of waves. It's this wave and particle, indeterminate. Because if we know one, we don't know the other. It's this so far irreconcilable nature of this. Remember? I often like to cite that Albert Einstein was actually most chuffed not so much about what he's known for. He is the most excited about the fact that he was the one who presupposed that sunlight is both waves and particles. This led to the fundamental breakthroughs in the understanding in the scientific world of actual reality, in terms of its complexity, in terms of its essentially. This is in a way the end of the old paradigm, the total end of the Newtonian world.
Yeah. Good riddance.
So in that. Yeah.
Good riddance to the Newtonian world. So what you're saying is really beautiful, and thank you for taking us on that exploration. I wanted to maybe bring it full circle and ask if you're speaking of this experience of being both the jiva and this infinity of waves, or the oceanic, vibration. Is that sort of, bringing things full circle? Is that mentioning what you said before about the juncture or the gap? Is the experience in between, so to speak, that particle and wave experience of the jiva and the infinite ocean, we might say. Is that kind of what you're getting at? That the experience is sort of in between those two realities, paradoxically?
Yes, we could say that, for example, if we want to please the scholars of Tantra, or perhaps that would displease them, who knows, and all the enthusiasts of care. Let's be more careful here. Let's use the term enthusiasts. If we want to kind of share something with the enthusiasts of Tantra, these aforementioned 4 levels of speech, which is very rich exposition known to all tantric scholars, obviously, and those who delved into Tantra more than just on introductory level, beyond the introductory level, which, by the way, would be very good to remind ourselves that it's not exclusively tantric.
Yeah.
It's actually belongs to the whole Vedic tradition. It belongs to the Vedic sciences. Tantra itself originates from Veda.
Mm-hmm.
Tantra as a methodology comes from Atharva Veda, from one of the 4 principal Vedas. It's the domain of the Atharva Veda, which is the least known of all the 4 principal Vedas. The Rig Veda, the Sam Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Atharva Veda. So the Atharva Veda, this is why, yes, scholars gives us rough dates, rough centuries, when the Tantra rose. From the 4th century, by the 10th century, we had some luminaries who gave us immortal accounts of, some of the tantric scriptures, and left some of their own most amazing works we can marvel today at. But Tantra did not arise around 4th century. It's a correct perspective. It's a scholarly perspective. And the job of a scholar, of course, to keep very close up or speak in vein of how everything fits within the history.
Yeah.
But Indian tradition is Vedic. The basis of all Indian spirituality is Vedic. And Vedic understanding of time is non-linear, it is concentric. Mm-hmm. And the Vedic understanding of the Vedas, that the Vedas did not arise at this or that time. Vedas are the compositions, essentially, which are of non-human origin. They were not composed because someone was hit by inspiration, although that is not a big harm to say that. It was certainly a great hit, still remains popular today, to this day, must be a hit. So that when we speak of the Vedic understanding, the aham vedam, that expression, it's that sudden exclamation, realization that I am Veda, aham vedam, I am Veda. Veda here stands for that, essentially, science, for that wisdom, for that knowledge, for that, essentially, which could be also called the universal law. It is that realization that even my molecular cellular structure, my nervous system, is an expression of the Ved.
Yeah.
It's an expression of the Ved, which is all expressed through sounds. And this took centuries to be composed. Rig Veda alone was composed throughout several centuries by the most modest estimation, by several authors, of course, who were all, as we know, were rishis. They were all seers of reality, that they were able to tap into these refined states of consciousness, to that primordial sound, where essentially they were able to bring out of these primordial sounds certain frequencies that were dressed into Sanskrit language as this or that hymn in Rig Veda. And the same goes for all the other Vedas. So Tantra, as it were, has no human origin. We cannot say Tantra was born on the, in 4th century because it was revolutionary teaching. It was revolutionary, but it was essentially a re-evaluation of more ancient teachings, we could say.
Yeah.
And if we talk about more ancient teachings, we could say, well, these were in turn re-evaluations of more ancient teachings. And there's no, that goes at infinitum, that reductionism into the past has no end.
Yeah.
We cannot find someone who one day gave us this. This is kind of like a little bit misperceiving, misunderstanding the essence of this wisdom. This wisdom is inherently our own.
Yeah.
It is vibrant in your own field, just now as it is vibrant in mine, just as it is vibrant in every listener.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Veda, of Vedic spirituality, no more Indian than theory of relativity, Jewish. So therefore, this is what makes it so terribly universal, if you will. It makes it terribly universal. It's like, yes, it's here to be taken because it's yours.
Yeah.
When you recognize, like, no, it's not. Well, I'm Christian. Well, I'm Muslim. My father is Muslim, so I'm actually. Well, I'm an atheist. What am I doing here? Okay, it's terribly interesting. And then suddenly we begin to feel, wait a minute. This is who I am in my most essential nature. Mm-hmm. I don't need to actually to be wrapped in saffron robes. I don't need to grow my hair or shave my hair or have a tilaka on my forehead. All these are optional, right? Mm-hmm. I can smear myself in ashes or I can smear myself in sandal paste, whatever takes your fancy. But the essence is that our reality is what these teachings address. So, forgive me, I forgot your original.
No, you're saying a lot of interesting things, and one thing that I like about you're talking about the Veda is, is not a sort of historical. Was something that someone had mentioned, or I was reading. Someone had mentioned the idea about the Vedas sort of emerging as a written text in response to the rishis kind of foreseeing the rise of the Kali Yuga, and so we can sort of trace the beginning of the Kali Yuga to the beginning of the transcribing of texts, because it was like the Kali Yuga is the age of this kind of disbursement and dissolving of the connection to this wisdom, and so in order to find some way to preserve it in whatever small way it could be preserved during the Kali Yuga was so it wasn't that they were written in response to kind of an evolution of technology, but rather that seeing that this was going to be the only way that they could be preserved in this time of darkness, I guess. I'm
not sure if I'm fully understanding this perspective. Not that I don't understand where it comes from. I should perhaps say I'm not sure if I fully share this perspective. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there could be an alternative perspective. That, well, first of all, Vedas were not written down. They were composed.
Yeah.
Right? As we've agreed earlier, that there were oral transmissions. They were composed and they were recited. They were written down much later, simply as a necessity to have it written down as a monument, as a literary monument.
Yeah.
Which happened to all cultures. Let's look at it maybe also from an alternative view. How about if we see the rise of these hymns through the enlivened neurophysiological structures of the rishis, where for the sole purpose of singing the glory of their own realized essence. And it is, therefore, both most profound spiritual teaching and a greatest work of art, if ever there was composed one.
Yeah.
After all, for centuries of attempts to decode Rig Veda, both posed so many scholars, so many troubles, so many arguments. There is this wonderfully, beautifully kind of upheld understanding now, at least among some, that Rig Veda is nothing other than greatest hymn to Shakti ever sung. Everything that is spoken in Rig Veda, all these deities, all these rites, all these sacrifices, all these offerings that aim to to satisfy, to quench the thirst of gods, so that the gods are happy, and then in turn sustain us. All this esoteric language, all this filtering the soma, right, through the cotton wool, all this filtering the soma endlessly, so that the gods can be satisfied, have been seen by many scholars as, that there was even this reductionistic perspective that just because Aryans or the early Indian civilization was, settled civilization from maybe phase of being nomads, and then they were entirely dependent on the livestock. So all these verses are to reassure essentially this symbiotic relationship with nature, where dependent on that livestock. But this is such a reductionistic, such kind of like, I would say, narrow understanding, where we have given, and we have these amazing accounts coming from those who have deciphered the meaning of these verses, the meaning of this, right? The suktas composed into hymns, arranged into hymns, which is nothing other than exalted attempt at singing the glory of this process of realizing our central nature. So it is actually a hymn to this Mother Divine, hymn to Shakti itself. All together, it's the whole process of self-realization. The whole yogas are here. Though the terms yoga, you would not find them in Rig Veda. The term kundalini, you would not find this in Rig Veda. Yeah. But the whole process is that one process of alchemical transformation. And that final somic phase, that lunar phase of this twinkling soma, the soma pavamana, like the 9th and the 10th mandalas, which are all dedicated to the soma pavamana, which is essentially that lunar aspect, nectarian aspect, which is known to all those who have studied yogic tradition, that is the very final goal of yoga is to be able to taste the nectar of one's own immortality as we are in the physical body. So there are different perspectives. All these Vedic hymns don't have to be necessarily as survival tools, if you will, like survival guidelines in the hard times. Yeah. But they're just as appropriate in golden age as it is now in the iron age.
No, I want to clarify what I meant, because I think I didn't communicate it well. So I think that the idea wasn't that that they were composed for the Kali Yuga. I think what he was saying was that, yeah, they were composed and they're eternal, but they were written down for the sake of for the Kali Yuga, which was sort of a fine point. But anyway, so one thing that I wanted to ask you, because I love that we're sort of ending, nearing the end of our conversation at the beginning in a certain kind of way with the Veda, but I'm just curious personally, because seeing as you do, tracing these traditions back to the Veda, there's a lot of traditions that take their cue from a kind of critique of the Veda. I'm thinking Buddhism and some other traditions, and you could say Samkhya, from a certain perspective, would be a kind of rejection of the kind of ritualized, what they see as like the empty rituals of the Vedic. The Brahmins. So what is the status of, based on what you're saying as, it's connected to the Veda in this way and it's all there, then what is the status of those traditions that are critiquing the Veda? Are they critiquing a certain idea that they have about the Veda based on a historical juncture, or is there something else there?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if I'm qualified to respond to that. After all, I don't claim to be a scholar. So I'd like to make it very clear that I cannot really speak in any authoritative terms about these matters, right?
Okay.
However, since you've asked, I'll give it a try. Perhaps distinction simply needs to be drawn between what these stands were made for rather than against.
Yeah.
So in other words, the stands were not made against Veda or Vedic knowledge, certainly not. But it's that reevaluating that what is known as eternal way, eternal law, eternal religion, eternal truth, that Sanatana Dharma. And the core is always what is relevant in any given moment in time. So at the time of Buddha, it was relevant to separate the wheat from the chaff and to point directly what is all this science of union is about. So it's not so much about the elaborateness of the ritual. It's not so much about the elaborateness of the way the offering is performed. And there's very little value in that if that offering is not being experienced firsthand here.
Yeah.
It became, as it were, objectified in the outer ritual.
Yeah.
So we could say Buddha makes this radical departure where he exalts the nature of nirvana, the action in freedom from the binding influences of karma. It's essentially, first of all, it's that to be in freedom is considered to be that nirvana here also could easily be misinterpreted. It's not extinguishing the world. I'm sorry, this is why I said I'm not a scholar, so please don't crucify me for saying something here some will find blasphemous. But what Buddhism was turned into is not necessarily what Buddha taught.
Yeah.
We cannot really be sure what was Buddha's stand on non-self and whether he indeed exalted and installed the teaching of shunyata or shunya that Buddhism is known for. Of course, there are different perspectives. Buddhism is so rich and so diverse. There's Madhyamika, there is Zen Buddhism, there's so many different types. There's Tibetan Buddhism, which is a totally different story. But we can certainly see that the essence of Buddha's teaching was an emphasis on nirvana, which also can be misinterpreted. That nirvana represents here extinguishing this worldly existence. Nirvana is that freedom. So in other words, it's not extinguishing the flame of individual existence, as sometimes it is interpreted, but rather extinguishing this pseudo-identification where one attributes, it's in a way, it's in continuation of the yogic teaching on the essence of karma yoga, but taught in a revolutionary way. In view of other historical figures, like you've asked why, no one really was like, the Buddhist teaching is steeped in Vedic philosophy, steeped literally, inseparable from. And it's a matter of fact. This will be kind of even not even. It will be a waste of time trying to find where Buddha went wrong or where he was right. This is culture itself, tradition itself absorbs Buddha into the pantheon of these incarnations of the principles responsible for the preservation of Dharma. We know him to be one of the Mahavatars. We know Buddha to be one of the incarnations of Vishnu. Vishnu is that principle which is responsible for the sustenance. So he comes here to break in order to sustain. So they're just like my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really beautiful description of that kind of process. And I like the idea of thinking of it not as breaking from, but doing something in order to preserve or affirming something that maybe in the kind of, cultural environment is things are getting ossified, and so a kind of freshness needs to be brought based on whatever's happening. So I think that's a really fruitful way to think about it. So, we've been talking quite a while now, and it's been such a wonderful conversation. I've been going a little longer than my normal interviews because this has been so fascinating. So I'm trying to think of like the best note to end on, and we've talked about the Veda now, and you talk about. I guess I'll just ask a question that I'm interested in hearing about, because I sort of feel this way a little bit, and it's sort of a cultural question and also a metaphysical question. But the path of the heart, as a way of describing this. This path is. You mentioned in one of the interviews, the written interview, about how this is not to be confused with emotionality, and I really this is something that I in my own experience, conversations with people, I've often slapped up against this, is that there seems to be a confusion between the heart, what the heart represents, and this kind of, I love using the word emotionality about it, and so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about when we're talking about the sacred heart, or the heart of recognition, or the heart of reality, and our intimacy with that, it's not this kind of superficial emotionality that we sometimes see in, I don't want to criticize any traditions, but there are certain devotional traditions that seem very hung up on this idea that it's, this emotional roller coaster up and down, crying, screaming, all of this stuff. Whereas I feel like what you're teaching is a little more subtle than that, or there's something more, there's something more subtle about that. So if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, you must have encountered that additional line there, that the path of the heart is not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah.
And it's an important reminder, in my view, for those who feel perhaps affinity on hearing about that. And I welcome that question very much, because it's a very important distinction. In fact, the path of the heart, if some people think that this is that's great, that's, it sounds much better, like in order to walk the path of jnana, the path of intellectual discrimination, requires so much knowledge, requires so much study, then the path of the heart is a different path. Because we could hear that, yes, of course, that in the richness of different methodologies, in the richness of different traditions, and within these traditions there are always different paths. The truth is one, right? Or the paths are many. All these sayings, I cannot exactly say the way.
Truth is one, paths are many. Yeah.
Yeah, something along these lines. But though no matter how many of these paths, we can narrow them down, right? There are, after all, still something which then could be called a path. And there are distinctively defined paths to oneness that work because of certain reasons. And the path of the heart could be, if one want to have this most impressive immediate understanding, is that if we then, after we have spoken, let's say, if we had more time, on different paths. And if we wanted to then classify them somehow, then we will inevitably have two most distinctive, most important paths, as it were, which run in parallel to this, essentially what then becomes our chosen. Sometimes we can choose it, sometimes it chooses us. It makes no difference. And that is the path of discrimination, perhaps could be called Jnana Marga, right? The path of wisdom, the path of intellectual discrimination, and the path of Hridya Marga, which is the path of indiscrimination. And so the path of discrimination versus the path of indiscrimination. One is the path where we dissect everything, we never settle in. It requires tremendous force and maturity of intellect, not just mind. Mind has to be subordinate. Essentially, we're speaking about, I don't know, beings like Arjuna, okay? We're speaking about these heroes of these scriptures. It requires an evolved being. Mm-hmm. It requires an evolved being, evolved mentally, psychologically, and then this intellectual approach is where one essentially refines this feather to the degree where every final layer is being peeled off. But the path of the heart is of a different kind. The path of the heart is the path of indiscrimination. In other words, it's the path where the main methodology is all-embracing aspect rather than discriminating aspect. Rather than dissecting, one embracing it. And it's very different in its nature. Yeah. Very different, because you hear a lot these days, well, not just these days, there's a lot of teachers who emphasize the so-called shadow work, right? The necessity for psychological maturity obviously is a prerequisite. Yeah. We cannot say that is not. And that prerequisite, requires sometimes essentially fully become aware of all one's patterns in terms of all these mishaps, all these blind spots. It's inevitable. And the inner work, the so-called inner work, the shadow work. In the path of the heart, the approach is different. Not that one is advised to bypass this, not at all. But in the indiscriminate approach, what is important here is that first and foremost understanding that the heart already contains it all. Yeah. In other words, it's also a non-dual path. Non-dual path, this Advaita path, that the path of the heart exemplifies, takes the stance of non-rejecting anything and embracing everything. So in other words, every shade, every minute shade, everything is being here recognized as various different shades of the totality of one's being. If you just contemplate for a moment, all of us, if we contemplate for a moment, that's quite also, well, to me this is not a trivial kind of thing. This is why when people first respond very favorably towards the path of the heart, because it sounds good, and you called it also earlier when you were structuring the question, that beyond the emotionality and excessive kind of like romantical ideas and romanticizing what the path of the heart could be, all the way, one can easily confuse the path of the heart with the soap opera, of going around the circles.
Of the what?
With the soap opera.
Oh, a soap opera, yes.
Yeah, we're like just going around the circles with the same stuff. Well, it's all part of my heart, right? It's it's all embracing here. Mm-hmm. So of course, these distinctive pathways, they have territories which are overlapping, but the path of the heart here is characterized by this indiscriminate nature of one's essential reality, which the heart here equates essentially with God, with love. And the main methodology here is grace, the power of grace, the force, the major force of love. It's that what transforms us. Mm. And again, when we speak of love here, we don't speak of love as an emotion. We speak of love as that most powerful wave within consciousness, which essentially, though it's a wave, it contains the magnanimity of the ocean itself. And yes, we can speak of the different channels, how the love can run through these individualized channels, and all of them are expressions of this universal love. But when it comes to the realization of our essential nature, the path of the heart exemplifies these very qualities, all-embracing qualities. If you will, I personally view the tantric path as the path of the heart. And to me, the tantric teaching, as far as I see this in the exposition of its major masters and major figures, most influential figures, they all taught that the core is in the heart. And this is why I feel also very free in terms of the spiritual discourses. As soon as I feel that someone begins to feel too tantric, I'm in no time put on my Sufi hat, because it's because as soon as we start forming conceptual ideas, we are in danger. Yeah, we lost the point, exactly. And it is this, the path of the heart, with everything that I said to you, it's like the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So it cannot be talked about. It can only be actually experienced. This is why, that's why it is the path of the heart.
Yeah.
It's literally where every experience is reconciled at the very core of our being, and that is the heart.
Yeah.
It's not the physical heart. It's not the anahata chakra. It's the seat of consciousness. All prana gathers here. All pranic flows gather here. People speak about awakening here or there, right? In all awakenings, there is the internalization of prana, and prana always internalized in the heart. In the deep sleep consciousness, when we go to sleep in a dreamless state, the prana is gathered in the heart. It happens on a daily basis. And if that is true to just that relative, because waking, dreaming, deep sleep are relative states of consciousness. They have rise and end. They have the duration. So much more for that transcendence and that heart as the seat of consciousness, as the seat of all the pranas. It's the heart of all that we experience, all perception, ebb and flow from here. The very subject and object is born outside as that wave that comes from the heart and returns to the heart. So this is really, the path of the heart is also far from just abstract kind of feeling and emotion. The emotion here, to rehabilitate so that some listeners don't jump into conclusions, emotions here is the methodology as well. Feeling is a methodology as well here. Everything is. How could it be otherwise?
Yeah. Wow. That's really beautiful. What a great note to end on. So, Igor, this has been such a fascinating and beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for offering your time to speak with me. I know our listeners are really going to enjoy this interview. So just to close, I just wanted to offer you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about, any programs, retreats, trainings, anything that you're up to that you might want to share with our audience.
Well, the most important program is that we are working towards creation of spiritual centers. This is the main program. All the rest is just, if people are interested, if people are found this in any way inspiring, then there is a website link, and people can go into events page. To tell the truth, I cannot tell you the dates and things because I don't remember them. I know that I'm traveling in less than 2 weeks' time. I'm going to Los Angeles, and I'm going to be away for 2.5 months. Okay. I'm going to be away, so there are plenty of events planned, but it's all on the website. So
the website is Igor Kufayev. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just that. It's igorkufayev.com. Mm-hmm. It's my name, and .com. And everything is there, really. But since you gave me this airtime, I wanted to... The program is not so much what happens in this workshop, in that workshop. You see, I'd like to take this airtime for that. All this essentially is towards establishing these units where these ongoing researches into consciousness can be conducted.
Yeah. Are you going to be in New York or on the East Coast at all?
Not just yet, unless you're going to organize something, and we'll jump on the occasion.
Yeah, I think we should. We should definitely.
Well, we welcome that wholeheartedly. At the moment, the work is mainly we're going to the same places because there is already a pattern in terms of the places we run these programs, and the programs are, we haven't spoken about this, but they require certain, it's not just retreat where people come and listen, obviously. These are transformative workshops where a lot happens, and a lot of phenomena. And these workshops are accompanied by phenomena. And so far we came up with a format which essentially is a week long with optional 3 days of a spillover as an integration cushioning period. But a week long is a must. And of course I offer the kind of a 2 or 3 hour darshans and weekend introduction workshops for people to taste this work. But all this is so far only in California, British Columbia, and in Europe. So we will welcome any opportunity to go anywhere else where we are invited. It's just as simple as that.
All right. Well, we're gonna have to make that happen in New York because I think that the community here would really connect with your teachings. So, thank you so much, Igor. It's been a real pleasure.
No, it's the joy is all mine. I'm sorry, Jacob. The joy is mine. The light is all mine.
All right.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.